Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Nestled between the rugged hills of Idaho and Washington state, the Lewis-Clark Valley was the kind of place that made you believe in simpler times. The Snake River curved lazily through the landscape, catching the last golden light of evening like a painter had planned it that way. Small towns dotted the valley, Lewiston on the Idaho side, Clarkston just across the river in Washington. Twin cities in name and in spirit, separated by a bridge but connected by everything else. The same grocery stores, the same high school rivalries, the same faces at the same diners on the same Sunday mornings. People here knew each other. That was simply the way of things. You could walk down Main Street in Lewiston on a Tuesday afternoon and run into your third-grade teacher, your dentist, and your neighbor's cousin all within the span of a single block. There was a comfort in that, a warmth that the valley seemed to hold year-round, even when the winters came in hard and the river ran steel, gray beneath an overcast sky. Families planted roots here and stayed for generations. People retired here. People chose this valley deliberately over the noise and speed of bigger places, because there was something in the air that felt honest. It was a community built on trust, and that trust, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, would be shattered in ways that nobody in the Lewis-Clark Valley could have ever prepared themselves for. Because someone was hunting here, quietly, patiently, methodically, and for a long time. Nobody knew. The first signs that something was deeply wrong didn't arrive with sirens or screaming. They arrived the way all truly terrible things do, slowly, quietly, in the form of an absence. A young woman who didn't come home when she was supposed to. A phone that rang and rang with no answer. A front door left unlocked when it was always locked. Small things, the kinds of things that, individually, you could explain away. But when they started stacking up, one on top of another, the people of the Lewis-Clark Valley began to feel something they hadn't felt before. Fear. Real fear. The kind that settles into your chest and doesn't leave. Because young women were disappearing from this valley, and nobody knew where they were going. To understand what happened in the Lewis-Clark Valley, you have to understand the world these young women lived in. You have to see them not as victims, not yet, but as people. Fully realized. Fully alive. Full of everything that makes a human being worth knowing. Donna Eckhart was 22 years old when she vanished. She had brown hair that she wore long. A laugh that people described as infectious, the kind of laugh that made you want to be in on the joke, even when you didn't know what the joke was. She worked at a local diner, had been working there since she was 17, and she was the kind of employee that owners dream about, reliable, warm, always early, never complaining. The regulars loved her. There were customers who came in specifically on her shifts, because she remembered their orders, remembered their names, remembered the small details of their lives that most people would have let slip away. She was studying part-time at Lewis-Clark State College. Business administration, she had plans. She talked about them openly, without embarrassment, without the self-consciousness that sometimes makes young people away from their own ambitions. She wanted to open her own restaurant someday. Something small, something personal. She had even sketched out rough ideas in a notebook she kept under the counter at the diner, menu concepts, color schemes, names she was considering. She was loved by her family with the specific, fierce love that parents reserve for children who have turned out better than they ever dared hope. Her mother, Carol, would later describe her as the kind of person who made every room feel safer just by walking into it. Her younger sister followed her around like a shadow when they were children, and even as adults. Even after Donna moved into her own apartment on the east side of Lewiston, they talked on the phone almost every evening. Almost every evening. Until they didn't. Donna Eckhart was last seen on the evening of September 14, 1979. She had finished her shift at the diner at 7 o'clock, same as always. A coworker watched her walk out to the parking lot. The evening was warm, the kind of late summer warmth that feels borrowed, like the season is giving you one last gift before it leaves. Donna had waved goodbye. She had said she'd see everyone tomorrow. She never came back. Her car was found 2 days later, parked on a quiet side street 4 blocks from her apartment. The keys were inside. Her purse was on the passenger seat. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken glass, no indication that anything violent had occurred in or around the vehicle. It was as though Donna had simply stepped out of her life and kept walking. Her family filed a missing persons report immediately. The police took it seriously. Lewiston was not a city where young women simply, but in those early days, without evidence of a crime, without a body, without any witness who had seen anything alarming, the investigation had nowhere to go. It moved forward in the way that investigations without evidence always move forward. Slowly. Frustratingly. With far too many dead ends, Carol Eckhardt hung flyers on every telephone pole in Lewiston and Clarkston. She called the police every single day. She spoke to local newspapers. She did everything a mother could possibly do, and she did it with a calm, determined ferocity that masked the terror underneath. Because Carol knew, in the way that mothers sometimes know things without being able to explain how, that something had happened to her daughter. Something bad. Something that couldn't be explained away with theories about Donna needing space, or running off with someone, or starting over somewhere new. Donna would never have left without saying goodbye. Not to her mother, not to her sister. That simply was not who she was. The second disappearance came 8 months later, May of 1980. Her name was Kimberly Ann Logan, and she was 19 years old. She had grown up in Clarkston, on the Washington side of the valley, in a house on a street lined with oak trees that turned extraordinary colors every autumn. She was a freshman at Lewis Clark State College, the same school where Donna Eckhardt had been taking her business classes, and by every account she was thriving. She had made friends easily, the way some people do, with a naturalness that others spend their whole lives trying to manufacture. She played guitar badly and enthusiastically, and her dormitory neighbors would later tell investigators that the sound of her practicing drifted through the walls most evenings, cheerful and slightly off, key and somehow deeply comforting. She called home every Sunday without fail. She was studying elementary education. She wanted to teach second grade specifically. She had given this a great deal of thought and had determined that second grade was the perfect age, old enough to have real conversations, but still young enough to find magic in ordinary things. Her mother kept a letter that Kimberly had written during her first semester, describing a moment in a campus coffee shop when she had helped a lost child find his parents, and how that small moment had confirmed everything she already believed about what she wanted to do with her life. She was 19 years old, and she already knew exactly who she was. Kimberly was last seen on the evening of May 7, 1980. She had attended a study group in the college library until approximately 9 o'clock. 3 fellow students confirmed this. Confirmed that she had been fine, had been in good spirits, had mentioned she was planning to walk back to her dormitory, because the evening was nice and she liked the air. The dormitory was less than half a mile from the library, a walk she had made dozens of times. She never arrived. Her dormitory roommate assumed she had stayed late at the library or gone to a friend's room. It wasn't until the following morning, when Kimberly's bed was still made and her guitar was still propped against the wall exactly where it always was, that the roommate began to feel the first cold edge of alarm. The report went in by midday. By the time investigators began to connect the disappearance of Kimberly Logan to the disappearance of Donna Eckhardt, both young women, both connected to Lewis Clark State College, both vanishing in the evening hours, both without any trace, any witness of where they had gone, a quiet but unmistakable dread had begun to spread through the valley. This was not coincidence. This was something else. The Lewis Clark Valley sits in a geographical cradle formed by the confluence of the Snake and Clearwater rivers. It is a place of genuine striking beauty, the kind of landscape that stops people mid-sentence when they see it for the first time. The hills rise steeply on either side, covered in bunch grass and basalt outcroppings, and in the right light, at the right time of year, the whole valley glows amber and gold in a way that makes you understand why people settled here and never left. But geography can work against an investigation just as easily as it works for a postcard. The valleys and draws that carved their way through those hills created dozens of remote, difficult-to-access areas. Old logging roads wound up into the highlands and ended in clearings where nobody went unless they had a reason. The river provided natural corridors that moved away from the towns quickly, away from eyes, away from witnesses. For someone who wanted to move through this landscape without being seen, who knew the terrain, who understood which roads were watched and which were not, the Lewis-Clark Valley offered ample cover. Law enforcement in the area was stretched thin in the way that rural law enforcement so often is. Lewiston had its own police department. Nez Perce County had a sheriff's office. Assautin County, across the river in Washington, had its own jurisdiction. These agencies communicated, but in the pre-digital era of the late 1970s and early 1980s, communication between jurisdictions was a slower, more cumbersome process than it would become in later decades. A pattern that might have been immediately obvious with Mauger to emerge. By the time it did emerge, the pattern had already cost lives. The investigators who worked these cases were not incompetent. They were experienced, they were dedicated, and they were doing everything they knew how to do with the resources they had. But they were dealing with something that didn't behave the way crimes usually behaved in a community like this one. There were no witnesses. There were no bodies. There was no physical evidence connecting the disappearances to any specific location or any specific person. There was only the absence of young women who should have been there, and the growing, horrible certainty that someone was responsible. Detective Raymond Hauser had been with the Lewiston Police Department for 11 years when Donna Eckhart disappeared. He was the kind of investigator who didn't make speeches, didn't grandstand, didn't speak to reporters more than he absolutely had to. He kept a battered spiral notebook that he carried everywhere, filling it with observations in a small, cramped handwriting that his colleagues had long since given up trying to read over his shoulder. He was methodical in a way that some people mistook for slowness, and he had a reputation for staying on cases long after other investigators had moved on. He had been assigned the Donna Eckhart disappearance from the beginning. When Kimberly Logan disappeared 8 months later, he was the one who sat across from her parents in a conference room at the police department and listened to them describe their daughter with the careful, devastated precision of people who were trying to make an investigator understand exactly who they had lost. He took notes in his cramped handwriting. He asked quiet questions. And when the meeting was over and the parents had left, he sat alone at his desk for a long time. He pulled out the Eckhart file. He spread both files across his desk and stared at them together. Similar ages. Both connected to Lewis-Clark State College. Both disappearing in the evening hours. Both last seen within a relatively contained geographic area. Both leaving behind everything, cars, purses, personal belongings, as though the disappearance had been sudden, unplanned on the victim's part. As though something had intercepted them. He picked up the phone and called the Assautin County Sheriff's Office. He wanted to know if they had anything similar on their side of the river. They did not. Not yet, but they would. The third victim's name was Susan Marie Fowler. She was 24 years old, a nursing student, a runner who logged 5 miles every morning before the sun was fully up. She had red hair and a practical, no-nonsense manner that her nursing instructors appreciated and her friends found endearing. She had grown up in a small town in eastern Oregon and had moved to Lewiston specifically to attend the nursing program at St. Joseph Regional Medical Center, which had a strong reputation in the region. She lived alone in a small apartment near the hospital, within easy walking distance of the clinical rotations that occupied most of her time. She had a boyfriend named Daniel, who worked in construction and who was, by all accounts, devoted to her in the straightforward, uncomplicated way of someone who had found the person they wanted and wasn't interested in pretending otherwise. They had been together for 2 years. They talked about moving somewhere together after she finished her degree. Maybe Boise, maybe Portland. Maybe somewhere with mountains and a hospital that needed good nurses. Susan disappeared on the evening of October 3, 1980. She had finished a clinical shift at the hospital at 6 in the evening and had called Daniel from a payphone outside the building. He remembered the call clearly, the way you remember ordinary moments once they have been reframed by loss. She had sounded tired but good. She had talked about a patient she'd seen that day, an elderly man who had made her laugh. She said she was going to walk home, get a shower, and then maybe fall asleep early because she had a 6 a.m. rotation the next morning. She said she loved him. She hung up. She never made it home. Daniel called her apartment at 9 o'clock when she hadn't called back as she sometimes did in the evenings. No answer. He called again at 10. No answer. He drove to her apartment, found it dark and locked, her mail still in the box, her lights off. He called her friends. He called her hospital. He called the police. By the time Susan Faller's disappearance was officially logged, Detective Hauser was already on his way to the scene. 3 young women, 3 disappearances, all in the Lewis Clark Valley. All without a trace. The dread that had been quietly spreading through the community now had a name, even if nobody was saying it out loud yet. People were whispering it in diners and church parking lots, and at the edges of conversations that shifted quickly when children walked into the room. Serial killer. Someone in this valley. Someone who moved through it freely, who knew it well, who blended in seamlessly, was taking young women. And nobody knew who. Detective Hauser requested a meeting with the Nez Perce County Sheriff's Office and the Asotin County Sheriff's Office. He brought his files, his notes, his cramped, handwriting spiral notebook. He laid the cases out side by side, and he made the argument that what they were dealing with was not 3 separate, unrelated disappearances but a single, ongoing criminal pattern. The meeting lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, an informal task force had been established. Resources would be shared. Information would flow more freely across jurisdictional lines. Investigators from both sides of the river would work together, rather than in the parallel isolation that had characterized the first year of these disappearances. It was the right call. It was also, by that point, already too late to save Susan Faller. But it would not be too late for everyone. The question that drove every meeting, every interview, every late-night session staring at files and maps and timelines, was the same question, repeated endlessly, turning over and over in the minds of every investigator involved. Who was doing this? Who in this valley, in this community of people who knew each other, who waved from front porches and held doors open, and brought casseroles when a neighbor was sick? Who among them was capable of this? The answer was closer than anyone wanted to believe. It always is. The task force began its work with the assumption that the perpetrator was local. Someone who knew the valley's geography intimately. Someone who understood the rhythms of these small communities. When streets were busy, when they were quiet, when a parking lot was watched and when it wasn't. Someone who could move through this landscape without attracting attention, because they belonged here, or at least appeared to. They started with the obvious categories. Known sex offenders in the Treat County area. There were 11 names on the initial list. Each was investigated, each had their whereabouts reviewed for the relevant evenings, each was interviewed. Several generated significant initial interest before their alibis were confirmed or the evidence pointed away from them. None of them, ultimately, led anywhere productive. They looked at people with connections to Lewis Clark State College, staff, faculty, former students, maintenance workers, anyone who might have had regular contact with the victims or regular access to the campus where 2 of the 3 women had been last seen or were connected to. This generated a list of hundreds of names, which investigators worked through systematically over weeks and months. They canvassed neighborhoods. They interviewed neighbors. They talked to anyone who might have seen something, and might have noticed something, might have heard something in the weeks leading up to each disappearance. Most of these conversations went nowhere, but occasionally something surfaced, a detail, an observation, something that didn't quite fit, and those details were carefully logged and cross-referenced. One detail kept coming up, different witnesses, different interviews, different time frames. A truck. An older model pickup truck, dark in color, some said dark blue, some said dark dank green, some said simply dark. that several people remembered seeing in the areas where the women had last been observed. Nobody had a plate number. Nobody had seen the driver clearly. But the truck kept appearing in the periphery of witness accounts, hovering at the edges of the story, like something not quite ready to step into the light. Hauser made a note of it in his spiral notebook. He underlined it twice. The truck was not much to go on. In a valley full of working men, full of construction crews and farmers and loggers and hunters, a dark-colored pickup truck was perhaps the least remarkable vehicle imaginable. Half the driveways in Lewiston and Clarkston had one. Half the parking lots at Lewis Clark State College had 3 or 4 on any given day. Asking someone in the Lewis Clark Valley to narrow down the owner of a dark pickup truck was a little like asking someone to identify a specific raindrop in a storm. But Detective Hauser was not the kind of man who discarded details simply because they were difficult. He went back through each witness account individually. He sat across from each person who had mentioned the truck, and he asked them to slow down, to go back to the moment they remembered seeing it, to close their eyes if that helped, and just describe what was there. Not what they thought they remembered. Not what seemed logical in retrospect. What was actually there in that specific moment, in that specific place. The accounts varied as eyewitness accounts always do, in the way that human memory is imprecise and suggestible and colored by everything that comes after the moment being recalled. But certain details held consistent across multiple witnesses. The truck was older, not ancient, but not new, probably late 1960s to mid-1970s vintage. The body style was consistent with a Ford or Chevrolet half-ton, though nobody was certain enough to commit to a specific make. It had a bench seat visible through the windshield in at least 2 accounts. One witness, a retired mechanic named Gerald Pitts, who had noticed the vehicle parked near the Lewis Clark State College library on an evening in early May of 1980. An evening that investigators now understood to be within the time frame of Kimberly Logan's disappearance. Described something else. A rifle mounted in the rear window. Empty, he said. No rifles in it at the time he saw it. But the rack was there. Hauser wrote that down and underlined it 3 times. A rifle rack in a pickup truck was, again, not unusual in this part of the world. Hunting was a way of life in the Lewis Clark Valley. The deer and elk seasons drew men from across the region into these hills every autumn, and many of them kept their racks mounted year-round simply because they were always there, always ready, always waiting for the next season to come around. But it was a detail, and details mattered. The task force issued a quiet, carefully worded request to law enforcement agencies throughout the region to flag any dark-colored pickup trucks to mid-1970s model, with a rear window rifle rack, in connection with any incidents or encounters that seemed relevant to the investigation. They did not release this information to the public. They did not want to tip off a potential suspect or cause panic in a community that was already frightened, but within law enforcement channels, the word went out. They waited. They kept working. In the meantime, the families of the 3 missing women were living in a particular kind of hell that has no adequate name. It is different from grief. Grief, as devastating as it is, has a shape to it. It has a beginning and a middle and eventually, somehow, an end. What these families were living with had no shape at all. It was formless. It was a question mark that never resolved into a period. A wound that couldn't close because nobody could tell them with certainty what had happened. Whether their daughter or sister or girlfriend was alive or dead. Whether she was suffering or at peace or somewhere in between. Carol Eckhart, Donna's mother, had stopped sleeping properly. She lay awake most nights running through possibilities, through scenarios, through every conversation she'd ever had with Donna, looking for something she might have missed, some warning sign she hadn't recognized, some detail that would finally make sense of the senselessness. She had lost weight. Her neighbors brought food she barely touched. She kept Donna's bedroom exactly as it had been, the posters on the walls, the books on the shelf, the small collection of ceramic animals on the windowsill that Donna had collected since childhood, because changing anything felt like giving up, and Carol Eckhart was not ready to give up. She would not be ready for a very long time. Kimberly Logan's parents had hired a private investigator, a retired police officer from Spokane who came with reasonable references and a calm, professional manner. He spent 6 weeks working the case, interviewing people the police had already interviewed, retracing routes, putting up flyers in communities further afield in case Kimberly had been transported out of the immediate area. He filed detailed reports and charged reasonable fees and ultimately turned up nothing that the task force didn't already know. He called the Logans at the end of his engagement and told them honestly that he had nothing new to offer, and that the police investigation appeared to be thorough and well run, and that he was sorry. They thanked him. They went back to waiting. Daniel Reeves, Susan Fowler's boyfriend, had thrown himself into action in the weeks after her disappearance with the frantic energy of someone who cannot bear to be still. He organized search parties. He drove the roads between the hospital and Susan's apartment over and over, sometimes in daylight, sometimes late at night, as though repetition might eventually reveal something that hadn't been there before. He spoke to anyone who would listen. He called the police department so frequently that the desk sergeant knew his voice before he said his name. Then, gradually, the frantic energy began to burn out, the way it always does, replaced by something quieter and much harder to carry. He kept a photograph of Susan on his dashboard. He would keep it there for years. Detective Hauser was sitting at his desk on a Thursday afternoon in March of 1981 when his phone rang. It was a deputy from the Asotin County Sheriff's Office, a young man named Prescott who had been assigned to the task force as a liaison 6 months earlier and who had developed, in that time, the same obsessive attention to detail that characterized Hauser's own approach to the case. Prescott had been following up on a routine tip. A woman named Beverly Marsh, who lived on a rural road outside Clarkston, had called the sheriff's office to report that a neighbor had been behaving strangely in the weeks before and after the disappearance of Kimberly Logan. She had waited a long time to call, she said, because she hadn't wanted to cause trouble for a neighbor, and because she wasn't sure it meant anything, and because people in the valley minded their own business, and she had been raised to do the same. But it had been sitting with her, getting heavier. And finally she had called. The neighbor's name was Robert Earl Lutz. Hauser asked Prescott to repeat the name. He wrote it in his notebook. He asked what specifically Beverly Marsh had observed. Prescott described it carefully. Lutz had been seen in the early morning hours on multiple occasions, leaving his property and returning with his truck, a dark-colored truck, she said, an older one, at hours that struck her as unusual. He had, in the days after Kimberly Logan's disappearance became public knowledge, made a point of coming over to Beverly's house and talking about the case, expressing shock and concern, asking questions about what she'd heard, what the police were saying, whether there were any leads. Beverly had found this curious at the time, because Lutz was not, in her experience, a man who engaged in neighborly conversation, kept to himself, rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then kept it brief. But after Kimberly Logan went missing, he had been chatty, almost eager to talk about it. Hauser set down his pen. He asked Prescott to pull everything available on Robert Earl Lutz. What came back was both interesting and frustrating in the way that so much of this investigation had been. Robert Earl Lutz was 38 years old. He had grown up in the Lewis Clark Valley, born and raised in Asotin County, one of 4 children of a logging family that had worked these hills for 2 generations. He had graduated from Clarkston High School in 1961 and had spent several years working in the timber industry before a series of jobs that kept him moving: construction, farm work, a stretch driving for a freight company, a period working as a groundskeeper for a property management company in Lewiston. He had never been married. He lived alone on a small property outside Clarkston that he had inherited from his father. The house was modest, set back from the road, not visible from the street. It sat on approximately 8 acres that backed up against a rocky draw that wound up into the hills behind the property. He had one prior contact with law enforcement, from 1974, a misdemeanor charge related to a disturbance at a bar in Lewiston that had ultimately been reduced and resulted in a fine. Nothing violent on record. Nothing that have put him on any watch list. Any registry, any database that investigators would have flagged in their initial canvass of known offenders. He was, on paper, a perfectly ordinary man. But there were things about Robert Earl Lutz that did not sit right when you looked at them carefully. His employment history showed a pattern of short tenures, never staying anywhere long enough to establish roots or relationships, always moving on before anyone got too close a look. His neighbors on the rural road outside Clarkston described him with a consistent vocabulary: quiet, private, unfriendly but not aggressive. One neighbor said he sometimes heard Lutz's truck leaving in the middle of the night, but had assumed it was hunting or some kind of night work. Another said that Lutz had helped him once with a fence repair, had worked silently and efficiently and refused payment, and had made the neighbor feel, for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, vaguely uncomfortable the entire time. And then there was the truck, dark blue, a 1971 Ford F-100, with a rifle rack mounted in the rear window. Hauser drove out to the Assabet County Sheriff's Office the following morning. He met with Prescott in person, spread the files across a conference table, and they went through everything together. The connection to the truck description was significant but not conclusive. There were, as they both knew, dozens of dark-colored older Ford and Chevrolet pickups in the valley, and a rifle rack narrowed it down, but did not eliminate enough alternatives to constitute evidence. What they needed was something harder. They needed to place Lutz in the vicinity of one of the disappearances. They needed physical evidence. They needed a witness who had seen him with one of the victims. They needed something that would take him from a person of interest, which was what he was now at best, to a suspect. Getting that something would require careful, patient work. The worst thing they could do at this stage was move too quickly. If Lutz was their man and he realized he was being looked at, he might destroy evidence, might change his behavior, might disappear. They needed to build the case methodically, from the outside in, gathering what they could without alerting him. Hauser assigned Prescott to begin quiet inquiries in the communities where Lutz had worked, looking for anyone who remembered him, anyone who had observations that might be relevant. He himself began working backward through Lutz's timeline, trying to establish where the man had been on the evenings of September 1979, May 7, 1980, and October 3, 1980. It was painstaking work. Most of it went nowhere, but some of it didn't. A woman named Patricia Holden had worked as a cashier at a gas station on the Lewiston side of the Valley Bridge for nearly 20 years. She had a prodigious memory for faces and a habit of noticing details about customers that she had always attributed to boredom and the slow hours between busy periods at the register. She remembered people. She remembered what they bought. She remembered when they came in, and sometimes, if they were regulars, she remembered patterns. Prescott found her through a canvass of businesses near the road between Lutz's property and the Lewis Clark State College campus. She remembered a man who drove a dark blue truck, older model. He came in occasionally, not regularly, but enough times over a period of a couple of years that she recognized him when he appeared. He always paid cash. He rarely spoke beyond what was necessary to complete the transaction. She remembered him because of his hands, large, rough, the hands of someone who worked outdoors, and because of his eyes, which she described as flat in a way that she couldn't quite explain, but that had always made her want to complete the transaction quickly. She had seen him, she believed, on an evening in early May of 1980. She couldn't swear to the exact date, but she remembered the evening specifically because the gas station had been unusually quiet, and she had been reading a book behind the counter, and she remembered putting the book down when the truck pulled in because she recognized it. He had bought gas. He had paid cash. He had been heading, based on the direction he turned when he left the lot, toward the Lewis Clark State College area. It was not enough to arrest anyone, but it put a dark blue truck, consistent with Robert Earl Lutz's vehicle, in the general vicinity of the campus on an evening consistent with the time frame of Kimberly Logan's disappearance. Hauser added Patricia Holden's account to the file. The picture was assembling itself slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. Shapes emerging from the chemical bath, one uncertain outline at a time. Investigators conducted a thorough background check on Robert Earl Lutz that extended beyond the official records. They spoke to former classmates from Clarkston High School. They spoke to former coworkers. They spoke to the few people in the valley who'd known him over the years in any meaningful capacity. What emerged was a portrait of a man who had always existed slightly outside the normal boundaries of human connection. Former classmates remembered him as a loner, not aggressively antisocial, not the kind of person who got into fights or made trouble, but someone who seemed to occupy a separate world that ran parallel to, but never quite intersected with the world everyone else inhabited. He had been a competent student without being memorable. He had participated in nothing extracurricular. He had no close friends that anyone could recall, and when pressed for specific memories of Robert Lutz, most of his former classmates found that they didn't really have any. He had simply been there for 4 years, without leaving any real impression. One former classmate, a woman who had been in the same English class as Lutz for 2 years, remembered a specific incident that had stayed with her despite the decades between then and now. She had found a small animal she thought it was a bird, or possibly a mouse, that had been placed in her locker. It was dead. It had been arranged deliberately, carefully, in a way that didn't look like it had simply been dropped there. She had never found out who was responsible. But she had always wondered, when she thought about it, whether it had been Lutz. She couldn't say why. She just had that feeling. A former co-worker from the freight company where Lutz had worked in the mid-1970s remembered him as reliable and hardworking but deeply uncomfortable to be around in enclosed spaces. He described an occasion when Lutz had become visibly agitated during a conversation about a news story involving a missing woman in a neighboring county. Not upset in the way of someone who found the story troubling, but agitated in a way that the co-worker had found difficult to categorize at the time, and had thought about many times since. There was a consistency to these accounts, a thread that ran through all of them. Something about Robert Earl Lutz had always been wrong. People who had encountered him often couldn't articulate exactly what it was. They reached for words like quiet or private or strange, and knew those words didn't quite capture it. Because there were plenty of quiet, private, strange men in the world who were perfectly harmless. The thing about Lutz was something underneath those surface descriptors. Something in the eyes, the way multiple people mentioned. Something flat and distant and turned inward. Something that made you want to complete the transaction quickly and not look back. The task force was 6 months into its focused investigation of Robert Earl Lutz when the fourth woman disappeared. Her name was Angela Doris. She was 21 years old. She was a waitress at a restaurant in downtown Lewiston, a bright, funny, determined young woman who had moved to the valley from a small town in Montana 2 years earlier looking for a fresh start after a relationship that had ended badly. She had found the fresh start she was looking for. She had made friends. She had found an apartment she loved, a second-floor unit with a bay window that caught the morning light beautifully. She had started taking photography classes at the community center on Thursday evenings, and she was good at it. Her instructor had told her she had a natural eye, and she had laughed and said she was just trying to learn to see things properly for the first time. She disappeared on the evening of August 27, 1981. She had finished her shift at the restaurant at 8 o'clock and had been seen by 2 co-workers walking toward the part behind the building. It was still light. August evenings in the valley stayed light until nearly 9, and there was nothing alarming about the scene. She had said goodnight. She had been smiling. Her car was in the parking lot the next morning. She was not. The fourth disappearance hit the community with the previous 3, spread over 2 years, had been building toward. There was no longer any possibility of denial, no longer any comfort in coincidence. 4 women, all in the Lewis-Clark Valley, all gone without explanation, without evidence, without anyone who had seen what happened to them. The story broke nationally. Television crews arrived in Lewiston from Boise, Seattle, and Portland. The police department held a press conference that Detective Hauser attended, standing at the back of the room while his lieutenant fielded questions. watching the reporters and thinking about the file on his desk, and the man whose name he had been building a case around for 6 months. He could not say the name publicly. Not yet. Not without more. But he was running out of patience, and he suspected the man in question was not finished. That was the thing that kept Hauser awake at night more than anything else. Not the case is already closed, or rather not yet closed, still open and bleeding. It was the case is not yet written. The women walking to their cars right now tonight, in Lewiston and Clarkston, who didn't know that something in this valley had developed a taste for them. He went back to the office after the press conference. He opened the Lutz file. He read it from the beginning again, looking for the thing he had missed. It was a phone record that broke the stalemate. Investigators had subpoenaed phone records for Robert Earl Lutz going back 3 years. The process had taken time. Legal process in the pre-digital era moved slowly, and the task force had been careful to ensure that every step was properly documented, so that nothing they found would be vulnerable to challenge later. When the records finally arrived, investigators spent days going through them. Most of it was unremarkable. Lutz didn't use the phone often. He had no apparent social network requiring regular communication. The calls he made were to utility companies, to suppliers for work-related purposes, to a hardware store he used regularly. But there were 3 calls that stood out. 3 calls, each made from a payphone rather than his home line. The records showed up as collect calls, or traced through the payphone billing system that investigators had requested as part of the subpoena. Made from a payphone on a street in Lewiston within 1 mile of Lewis Clark State College. The first call was made on the evening of May 7, 1980, the evening Kimberly Logan disappeared. The second was made on the evening of October 3, 1980, the evening Susan Fowler disappeared. The third was made on the August 20, 1981, the evening Angela Doris disappeared. The calls were to a number that investigators traced to a motel in a small community 40 miles east of Lewiston. The motel confirmed that a guest had been registered on each of those 3 evenings. The registration name on each occasion was different. The physical description provided by the motel clerk who remembered one of the check-ins was consistent with Robert Earl Lutz. Hauser stared at the phone records for a very long time. Then he picked up the phone and called the county prosecutor's office. It was time to move. The county prosecutor's name was Margaret Elaine Voss. She had been in the office for 7 years, had tried dozens of felony cases, and had developed a reputation in the regional legal community for being precise, methodical, and almost impossibly difficult to rattle. She was the kind of prosecutor who read every page of every file herself, rather than delegating the detailed work to assistants. Who asked questions that made investigators uncomfortable, not because she was hostile, but because she wanted to understand every weakness in a case before opposing counsel found it for her. She read the Lutz file over 2 days. She met with Hauser and Prescott in her office on a Wednesday morning, a legal pad in front of her covered in her own notes, and she told them plainly what she saw. The circumstantial case was building. The phone records were significant. 3 calls from a payphone near the college campus, on 3 of the 4 evenings in question, was not something that could be easily explained away as coincidence. The motel connection, if it could be solidified, added another layer. The truck sightings, while individually inconclusive, formed a pattern when viewed together. Patricia Holden's account put the vehicle in the right place at roughly the right time. The neighbor's observations about Lutz's behavior in the aftermath of the Logan disappearance were consistent with someone who had knowledge of the crime. But there was always a but. What they did not have was physical evidence. They did not have a single piece of forensic material connecting Robert Earl Lutz to any of the 4 victims. They did not have a witness who had seen him with any of the women. They did not have a body. They did not have any of the bodies. And without physical remains, a prosecutor attempting to prove murder faced a challenge that defense attorneys loved and juries found genuinely difficult. They did not have a confession. And Margaret Voss had learned, over 7 years of prosecuting serious crimes, that circumstantial cases, no matter how well constructed, no matter how logical their internal architecture, had a fragility that direct evidence cases did not. Jurors wanted something they could hold in their hands. Something that couldn't be explained away by a competent defense attorney pointing to the absence of concrete proof. She told Hauser that she needed more. He told her he understood. He did not tell her how deeply that answer frustrated him, because he was a professional and because he respected her judgment, and because he knew she was right. But he drove back to Lewiston from her office with his hands tight on the steering wheel, thinking about Angela Doris and Susan Fowler and Kimberly Logan and Donna Eckhart, thinking about all the things they had wanted that they were never going to get, and he made himself a quiet, private promise that he was going to find what Margaret Voss needed. One way or another. The task force intensified its surveillance of Robert Earl Lutz. This was done carefully, methodically, with full legal authorization. Because the last thing Hauser wanted was to have any piece of the investigation contaminated by procedural error. A surveillance team was established that rotated personnel, so that no single officer spent too much time in the field, reducing the risk of Lutz becoming aware that he was being watched. The team tracked his movements, documented his routines, logged his comings and goings with the patient. Unglamorous precision that real investigative work actually requires, and that nothing in popular culture adequately conveys. What they found over the first several weeks was a man of almost rigid routine. Lutz rose early. He was outside by 6 most mornings working on the property or on his truck, which he maintained with meticulous care. He drove into Clarkston or Lewiston most weekdays for work. He had been doing odd jobs, handyman work, the kind of employment that required no fixed schedule and left large portions of his time unaccounted for. He stopped at the same hardware store. He bought groceries at the same market, always paying cash. He ate lunch at one of 2 diners, always alone, always at a corner table if one was available. He returned to his property in the late afternoon and stayed there through the evening. He never appeared to socialize. No visitors came to the property. He made no stops at bars or social gatherings. He attended no church, no community events, nothing that would put him in regular contact with other people. His life, as observed from the outside, was a closed circuit. He moved through the world collecting what he needed from it: food, fuel, materials for work, and then retreated back behind the tree line to the property that nobody else visited. This pattern held for 3 weeks and then it changed. On a Tuesday evening in late November of 1981, the surveillance team observed Robert Earl Lutz leave his property at approximately 7:30 p.m. This was unusual. His evenings were by the established pattern spent at home. The team followed at a careful distance as Lutz drove his dark blue Ford F-100 across the bridge into Lewiston and navigated through the residential streets on the east side of town. He parked on a quiet street 3 blocks from Lewis Clark State College. He sat in the truck for 45 minutes. The surveillance team held their positions watching. The engine of Lutz's truck was running. The street was quiet. A few students walked past on the sidewalk, visible at the far end of the block. Lutz made no move. He simply sat there, engine idling, watching the street. Then he drove away. He went home, arriving back at his property at approximately 9:15, and did not leave again that evening. The team filed their report. Hauser read it the next morning. He read it twice, then he called Prescott. He was watching, Hauser said. He was watching and he decided against it. Something stopped him. The time of year, Prescott said. Fewer students out in the evenings. Less foot traffic. Or he made us, Hauser said. There was a silence on the line. If he made us, Prescott said carefully. We need to know that now.
Yes.
Hauser agreed. We do. The surveillance team was reviewed. Personnel were rotated more aggressively. The protocols were tightened. Investigators went back through the previous 3 weeks of surveillance logs looking for any moment where the coverage might have been visible to a careful observer. They found nothing definitive, but the uncertainty was there, and it was uncomfortable, and it changed the calculus of the investigation in ways that Hauser spent the next several days thinking through very carefully. Because here was the problem. If Robert Earl Lutz was aware that he was being watched, if he had noticed the surveillance and adjusted his behavior accordingly, then the task force was in a difficult position. They could not maintain indefinite surveillance without a stronger legal basis than they currently had. The resources required were significant and finite, and if Lutz was sophisticated enough to have detected the surveillance, he was sophisticated enough to wait them out, to go quiet, to let the attention drift before resuming whatever it was he did in the dark hours when nobody was supposed to be watching. But there was another possibility that Hauser found himself returning to repeatedly, turning it over the way you turn over a stone looking at what lives underneath. What if Lutz had parked on that street, not because he was planning to take another victim, but because he wanted to be seen? What if he knew the investigation was closing in on him, and he was testing the edges of it, probing to see how close the net had come? What if Robert Earl Lutz was smarter and more deliberate than the profile they had constructed of him? Smarter than a man who acted on impulse? Smarter than someone who could be caught in the simple act of returning to familiar ground? Hauser had been building a mental model of the man for months, constructing it from the fragments of testimony and record that the investigation had assembled. Most of what he knew pointed to someone who was controlled, patient, methodical. Someone who planned. Someone who chose his moments carefully and left as little behind him as possible. That kind of person didn't get caught by waiting around outside a college campus on a Tuesday evening, unless he wanted to be seen. Hauser didn't share this theory with the rest of the team. Not yet. He needed to think it through further. But it sat at the back of his mind, and it colored every decision he made in the weeks that followed. In December of 1981, the investigation produced its first significant physical development. A hunter working a ridge in the hills above Asotin County, the hills that backed up against the draw behind Robert Earl Lutz's property, came across something in a remote clearing approximately 3 miles from any maintained road. He almost walked past it. He later said that what stopped him was a smell, a particular quality of the air in that part of the clearing, and that some instinct made him slow down and look more carefully at the ground rather than continuing on. He found disturbed earth. He was experienced enough to recognize what that meant. The disturbed earth was in a rough rectangle, approximately 6 feet by 3 feet, in an area that showed no other signs of recent human activity. There were no hunting blinds, no fire rings, no trail markings. Just the clearing, the disturbed earth, and the smell. He marked the location carefully with his GPS unit and hiked out to his truck. He drove to the nearest community with a phone and called the Asotin County Sheriff's Office. Prescott took the call. He called Hauser. By the time investigators reached the location the following morning, a full forensic team in tow, the temperature had dropped overnight and a light snow was falling through the trees, dusting the clearing in white. They documented the scene from the perimeter before anyone stepped inside the clearing. They photographed. They sketched. They took measurements. Then they began to excavate. What they found changed everything, and nothing, and everything again. The remains they recovered from that clearing were human. A forensic anthropologist, brought in from the state crime lab in Boise, confirmed this within hours of the excavation's completion. The remains were skeletal, consistent with a period of interment of approximately 1 to 2 years. The anthropologist estimated the individual had been female adult, between approximately 19 and 30 years of age. This placed the remains within the general parameters of the missing women. But skeletal remains, after 1 to 2 years in the ground in that climate, presented significant challenges for identification. There was no soft tissue preserved. Dental comparison would require dental records. The state of the remains made some analyses difficult and others impossible. There was no clothing recovered. The remains had been buried without it, which was itself a significant detail, and no personal effects. There were, however, 2 things that the forensic examination revealed with clarity. The first was the presence of trauma to the hyoid bone, a small, delicate bone in the throat consistent with strangulation. The second was the location, 3 miles from Robert Earl Lutz's property, through the draw that ran behind his house, up into the hills where no casual hiker or hunter would normally venture, in a clearing that was not visible from any trail or road, in ground that had been deliberately chosen for exactly the properties that had made it work, remote, hidden, unlikely to be disturbed. Hauser stood at the edge of that clearing in the falling snow and looked at the excavated earth and felt something shift in the case that had been carrying for 2 years. Not resolution. Not yet. But something that felt like the beginning of resolution. Like the first gray light before a dawn that was still hours away. The identification process took 6 weeks. Working from dental records provided by the families of the 4 missing women, forensic odontologists compared the recovered remains against 4 sets of charts. 3 comparisons were inconclusive. Either the records were incomplete or the state of the remains made precise comparison impossible. But the 4th comparison produced a match. The remains found in the clearing above Asotin County belonged to Kimberly Ann Logan, 19 years old, elementary education student, guitar player. Sunday phone calls home, she had been there. 3 miles from Robert Earl Lutz's property for approximately 16 months. Hauser drove to Moscow, Idaho, where the Logan family had relocated after their daughter's disappearance. And he sat across from her parents in their living room. And he told them what had been found and what had been confirmed. He did this job with the same quiet precision that characterized everything else he did. And he stayed as long as they needed him to stay. And he answered every question they had. And he told them that the investigation was active and ongoing, and that the people responsible for this would be held accountable. He drove back to Lewiston. He went to his office. He called Margaret Voss. "We have remains," he said. Confirmed identification. Kimberly Logan, 3 miles from Lutz's property. Theoid fracture consistent with strangulation. There was a silence on the line. "Tell me about the location," Voss said. He described it. The remoteness. The deliberate nature of the site. The absence of any obvious reason for an ordinary person to be in that clearing. The proximity to Lutz's property and the draw that connected his land to the hills above. "It's still circumstantial," Voss said. "The remains being found near his property doesn't place him at the site." "I know," Hauser said, "but it's the closest we've come." "Yes." Another silence. "Get me something that puts him with her," Voss said. "Get me something I can stand up in court with Raymond. Something that survives cross-examination." "I'm working on it," he said. The discovery of Kimberly Logan's remains changed the public dimension of the case as well. The story had never entirely left the news. The disappearances of 4 women in a small community over 2 years was not the kind of story that faded easily, but it had settled into a background frequency, a persistent hum rather than a sharp alarm. The discovery of remains brought the alarm back. Television cameras returned to Lewiston. Reporters camped outside the police department. The Lewis Clark State College campus, which had spent 2 years developing a careful, community-supported protocol for student safety in response to the disappearances, now faced a student body that was frightened in a fresh, acute way. The college president issued a statement. The mayor of Lewiston issued a statement. The county commissioners of both Nez Perce and Asotin counties issued statements. Everyone was saying in slightly different language, the same thing: the authorities are working on this. Please remain vigilant, we believe in this community. None of the statements mentioned Robert Earl Lutz. His name had not appeared in any public reporting. The task force had maintained strict control over what information flowed to the press, and so far that control had held. Lutz himself gave no public indication that he was aware of being investigated. His behavior, as monitored by the surveillance team, remained consistent with the pattern established over the previous months. In January of 1982, a woman named Charlene Briggs walked into the Lewiston Police Department and asked to speak to whoever was working the missing women cases. She was 41 years old. Compact and precise in her movements, with the manner of someone who had thought carefully about what they were going to say before saying it. She sat across from Hauser in an interview room and folded her hands on the table in front of her and told him that she had been wrestling with something for more than a year and had finally decided that not saying it was worse than saying it. She knew Robert Earl Lutz. Not well, she was quick to clarify. Not as a friend or an acquaintance in any meaningful sense. But she had encountered him on several occasions over the years through a connection she was reluctant to specify at first. A connection that turned out, Once she provided it to be a mutual acquaintance who had introduced them at a social gathering in the mid-1970s. She had interacted with him perhaps 6 or 7 times over the course of several years. Always in group settings, never alone. She had found him disturbing. That was the word she used. Not strange, not off-putting, not odd, disturbing. She said she had always trusted that feeling without being able to explain it to anyone else's satisfaction, and that it had caused her to avoid being in situations where she might encounter him. She told Hauser all of this as preamble, as context. Then she told him what she had come to say. In the late summer of 1981, she believed it was August, possibly early September. She had been driving on a rural road that passed within approximately a mile of the Lutz property. She had pulled over briefly because she had dropped something in the car and was reaching for it. She had been stopped for perhaps 2 minutes. During those 2 minutes, she had seen Robert Earl Lutz's dark blue pickup truck pull out of a side road onto the main road approximately 300 yards ahead of her and drive away in the opposite direction. She had noted this because she recognized the truck, having seen it at his property on a prior occasion. She had not thought much about it at the time, but in the weeks that followed, when Angela Doris's disappearance became public knowledge, she had gone back through her memory of that drive, working out the date as best she could, and she had come to believe that what she had seen had been on the evening of August 22, 1981. The evening Angela Doris disappeared, and the side road that Lutz had emerged from, the one she had seen his truck pulling out of, ran directly into the hills behind his property, directly toward the draw, directly toward the area where months later, the remains of Kimberly Logan would be found. Hauser listened to all of this without interrupting. When she finished, he asked her, quietly and carefully, whether she would be willing to provide a formal statement, and if it came to that, testify in court. Charlene Briggs led him steadily across the table. "That's why I'm here," she said. The investigation had been running for over 2 years when the task force finally felt the ground shift beneath them in a way that felt permanent rather than temporary. They had bodies, 1 confirmed, and 3 women still missing whose remains had not been recovered. They had physical evidence placing the confirmed victims' remains near the suspect's property. They had witness accounts placing the suspect's vehicle near the campus on evenings consistent with the disappearances. They had phone records placing the suspect near the campus on 3 of the 4 evenings in question. They had a new witness who placed the suspect's vehicle on a rural road near his property on the evening of the 4th disappearance, using a route consistent with access to the site where remains had been recovered. It was still circumstantial, but it was circumstantial in a way that was becoming very difficult to explain as anything other than what it appeared to be. Margaret Voss reviewed the new witness account. She asked Hauser a series of precise, probing questions about Charlene Briggs, her background, her credibility, her potential vulnerabilities on cross-examination. She reviewed the physical evidence from the recovery site, the forensic findings, the phone records, the surveillance logs. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I want one more thing before we move." Hauser waited. "I want to search that property," she said. "I want a warrant for the Lutz property, and I want a forensic team through every inch of it. If there's anything there, anything at all, I want it before we arrest him. Because once we arrest him, we have to charge him. And once we charge him, we have to be ready to take it all the way." Hauser nodded. "I'll have the warrant application on your desk tomorrow." He said he stood to leave. "Raymond," Voss said. He stopped. "How many more do you think there are?" she asked. "Woman we haven't found yet." Hauser stood in the doorway of her office for a moment, his hand on the frame. "I don't know," he said, "but I think we should be prepared to be surprised." He meant it as a warning. It would prove to be a significant understatement. The warrant application took 3 days to prepare. Hauser worked on it with the methodical thoroughness that had defined his entire approach to this investigation, assembling every piece of supporting documentation with the understanding that a search warrant application was not merely a legal formality, but a test of the case itself. Every claim made in the application had to be supported. Every inference had to be grounded in evidence. The judge reviewing it would ask the same questions that a defense attorney would eventually ask, and Hauser wanted every answer ready before the question was posed. He submitted the application on a Thursday morning. The warrant was granted by Friday afternoon. He called Prescott. He called the forensic team coordinator at the state crime lab. He called Margaret Voss. He made the calls in his car, sitting in the parking lot outside the courthouse, because he didn't want to wait until he got back to the office. He wanted everything in motion immediately, before anything could change, before Robert Earl Lutz could somehow sense what was coming, and do something irreversible with whatever he had on that property. The search was scheduled for the following Monday morning. The weekend between the warrant and the search was the longest of Raymond Hauser's professional life. He spent part of it driving, not for any investigative purpose. There was nothing productive he could do before Monday that hadn't already been done. He drove because driving helped him think, and because the alternative was sitting in his apartment staring at the ceiling running through worst-case scenarios that he couldn't afford to dwell on. He drove the roads of the Lewis Clark Valley, the ones he had driven dozens of times in the course of this investigation, the roads that connected the college campus to Lutz's property, the roads that wound up into the hills above Asotin County, the roads that the four missing women had traveled in their ordinary lives before their ordinary lives ended. He thought about them individually. He did this deliberately, making himself slow down and remember each woman as a person rather than as a case file. Donna Eckhart and her restaurant sketches, Kimberly Logan and her off-key guitar, Susan Fowler who had called her boyfriend from a payphone and said she loved him and hung up, Angela Doris who had been learning to see things properly for the first time. He owed them this. The remembering he drove until it was dark and then he went home. The search team assembled at the Asotin County Sheriff's Office at 6:30 Monday morning. There were 14 people in total. Investigators from the task force, forensic technicians from the state crime lab, a forensic anthropologist brought back from Boise, and a dog team with 2 cadaver-trained animals. The briefing was precise and organized. Everyone knew their role. Everyone knew the protocols. A separate team was assigned to locate and detain Robert Earl Lutz at a neutral location away from the property while the search was conducted. The plan was to intercept him at his usual morning stop, the hardware store in Clarkston where he bought supplies most mornings, and bring him in for a formal interview under the pretense of seeking his assistance with a local investigation. It was not a pretense that would hold for long, but it didn't need to. It only needed to hold long enough to get him away from the property and keep him there while the team did its work. The intercept team moved into position at 7 a.m. The search team moved to the Lutz property at 7:15. When confirmation came over the radio that Lutz had arrived at the hardware store and was being engaged by the intercept team, the property was accessed through the main gate, which was locked but yielded to a bolt cutter in under 30 seconds. The team moved in on foot, spreading out according to the predetermined search grid, each person moving through their assigned zone with the disciplined patience that forensic searches require. The house itself was the first focus. It was a single-story structure, perhaps 900 square feet, built in a style that suggested it had been constructed in the late 1940s, or modified piecemeal since then without any coherent plan. The exterior was weathered wood siding in a faded brown that had probably been red at some point decades ago. The windows were small and set high in the walls. The front door had 2 deadbolts installed, one original, one added later, newer hardware and older wood. Inside, the house was extraordinarily clean. This was the first thing every investigator noticed and remarked upon, independently of one another, as they moved through the structure. Not merely tidy or organized, clean in the specific, compulsive way. This was itself a kind of project, ongoing and deliberate. The floors had been scrubbed, the surfaces had been wiped down. The kitchen showed almost no evidence of regular use despite being the kitchen of a man who presumably prepared his own meals. The bathroom fixtures were spotless. There was a faint chemical smell throughout the structure that the forensic team coordinator identified immediately as bleach, Not the smell of recent cleaning, but the accumulated smell of repeated cleaning over a long period of time, worked into the surfaces and the walls and the air itself. The cleanliness was, paradoxically, itself a form of evidence. Luminol testing, a chemical that reacts to the iron in hemoglobin, revealing traces of blood invisible to the naked eye, was applied to the floor surfaces, the walls, the bathroom, the kitchen. The results were extraordinary. Under ultraviolet light, significant portions of the house lit up with the blue-white glow that indicated the presence of biological material that had been cleaned but not eliminated. The cleaner had been thorough. The cleaner had been systematic. But they had not been thorough enough. The pattern of luminol reaction in the main living area suggested a large quantity of blood had been present at some point and had been cleaned with significant effort. The bathroom showed similar reactions. The kitchen showed smaller but consistent traces. The forensic team photographed everything. They swabbed everything. They tagged and bagged and documented with the patient precision of people who understood that what they were collecting in these rooms might eventually be presented to a jury. In a locked storage room at the back of the house, the lock on this door was newer and heavier than the locks anywhere else in the structure. A padlock rated for serious security that had been installed into a reinforced hasp bolted directly into the door frame. Investigators found the room that Robert Earl Lutz had not wanted anyone to find. The lock was cut. The door was opened. What was inside was not, in the immediate sense, dramatic. There were no bodies. There was no obvious evidence of violence. The room was approximately 10 by 12 feet, with bare concrete walls and a concrete floor, lit by a single overhead bulb on a pull chain. There were shelving units along 2 walls, and on those shelves were boxes. Cardboard boxes, carefully labeled in a small, neat handwriting that investigators would later confirm matched Robert Earl Lutz's known writing samples. The boxes contained personal property, items of jewelry, items of clothing carefully folded, photographs, personal photographs, the kind that people carry in their wallets or keep in bedside table drawers, photographs of families and friends in ordinary moments. A small guitar picked purple, with a pattern of stars on it. A nursing school name badge with a photograph. A notebook with sketches of restaurant layouts and color schemes and menu ideas in a handing that Cart would later identify, without any doubt, as her daughter's trophies. Robert Earl Lutz had kept trophies from each of his victims. The investigators who worked through those boxes did so with the controlled professionalism their training demanded, cataloging and documenting each item with the same systematic care they brought to every aspect of their work. But later, in the parking lot afterward, on the drive back, in the days that followed, several of them would speak about the weight of that room, the specific, terrible intimacy of those boxes. The fact that this man had taken these things from these women and brought them back here and organized them and kept them, all this time, behind a heavy lock in a concrete room where he could be alone with them. It told them something about who they were dealing with. Something that went beyond the legal architecture of the case and into a territory that was harder to articulate but impossible to ignore. The cadaver dogs worked the property for 4 hours. They moved through the house, through the outbuildings, through the 8 acres of land that surrounded the structures. The 2 animals worked independently, covering the ground in overlapping patterns, their handlers following carefully and marking every location where the dogs indicated. The dogs indicated twice on the property itself, outside the structures. The first indication was in a garden area at the rear of the house, a vegetable garden, apparently, that had gone untended in recent seasons. The raised beds collapsed and overgrown. The dogs hit on an area at the far edge of the garden, near the fence line. The second indication was in a wooded area at the edge of the property, near the entrance to the draw that ran up into the hills behind. Forensic anthropologists and excavation teams moved to both locations. The garden site yielded nothing upon initial excavation. The indication was attributed to animal remains, likely a dog or large cat buried there some years prior, a common enough occurrence on rural properties that the dogs could not be faulted for flagging. The wooded site was different. At the entrance to the draw, in a shallow depression beneath the root system of a large ponderosa pine, Excavation revealed human remains. Unlike the remains found in the clearing 3 miles up in the hills, which had been skeletal aged, requiring the careful work of forensic anthropology to interpret, these remains were more recent. The condition indicated a period of interment significantly shorter than the 16 months estimated for Kimberly Logan's remains. The forensic anthropologist, working carefully in the gathering late morning light, made preliminary observations that were noted and recorded. Female, young adult, likely late teens to mid-20s. Trauma consistent with strangulation. A single item of personal property was recovered with the remains. A small silver bracelet with an engraved charm that bore a word investigators could not immediately read due to the condition of the piece. They photographed it. They bagged it. That evening, after the remains had been transported to the state crime lab, a technician cleaned the bracelet carefully and read the engraving on the charm. It said Angela. Back at the Asotin County Sheriff's Office, Robert Earl Lutz had been sitting in an interview room for 4 hours. The intercept team had brought him in smoothly. He had come without resistance. Had not asked for a lawyer, had presented himself with the flat, cooperative manner that investigators had been told to expect from their background research on him. He sat at the table in the interview room with his large, rough hands folded in front of him, and he answered the preliminary questions put to him with brief, unrevealing answers. Yes, he had lived in the valley all his life. Yes, he knew the area around Lewis Clark State College. No, he didn't knew any of the missing women personally. No, he couldn't think of any reason why his truck might have been observed near the college campus on those evenings. He drove through that part of town sometimes. Lewiston wasn't a big city. You passed through areas without necessarily having a specific reason to be there. He was calm. He was measured. His eyes, as multiple investigators would later describe in their reports, were flat in exactly the way that Beverly Marsh and multiple others had described over the years. Not frightened, not agitated, flat, tried inward. The lead interviewer, a veteran investigator named Sergeant Carol Dempsey, who had been brought in from the Idaho State Police specifically because of her experience conducting interviews in complex, high-stakes cases, had spent the 4 hours working through her approach methodically. She had not pushed. She had not confronted. She had not the room slowly, layer by layer, asking questions that seemed tangential. Questions about his daily routine and his work and his history in the valley. Questions designed to establish a baseline of his behavior and speech patterns before she began to move toward the territory that mattered. She received the radio communication about the locked room and its contents while Lutz was taking a bathroom break, escorted by a deputy. She read the summary twice. She adjusted her approach accordingly. When Lutz returned to the room and settled back into his chair with his hands folded on the table, Dempsey let the silence sit for a moment before she spoke. "Robert," she said, using his first name for the first time, "I want to talk to you about your house." Something moved behind his flat eyes. Not much, not dramatically, but something shifted. And Dempsey saw it, and she noted it, and she kept her own expression perfectly neutral as she continued. "Specifically," she said, "I want to talk about the room at the back." What followed in that interview room over the next 6 hours was a masterclass in investigative patience and a study in a particular human darkness that never gets easier to sit across from no matter how many times you've done it. Lutz did not confess immediately. He did not confess dramatically. He did not break down or weep or rage or do any of the things that people who haven't sat in interview rooms imagine people do when they're cornered. He adapted. He shifted his story in small, incremental ways, testing each new version against the information Dempsey was providing, feeling for the edges of what she knew and adjusting accordingly. The boxes in the locked room. He collected things, personal items that people left behind at job sites. He did a lot of work in homes and properties, and people left things. He kept them in case they were reclaimed. Yes, he admitted that. But it wasn't illegal. The luminal results in the house. He had kept animals inside at various times. Dogs that had been injuries. Blood from animals wasn't evidence of anything. His truck near the college campus on those evenings. He drove through that part of town regularly. He had said that already. He couldn't account for every evening of the past 3 years in detail. Could anyone? He was good. He was very, very good, and Dempsey let him be good. Let him construct his careful architecture of alternative explanations, because she knew something that he didn't yet know she knew. She knew about the guitar pick, purple with stars on it. She knew. Because Kimberly Logan's parents had confirmed it in a phone call made while Lutz was in the bathroom. That Kimberly Logan had owned exactly one guitar pick that she kept as a good luck charm rather than actually using it. Purple with stars. Her parents had given it to her when she started playing in high school. She had carried it in her wallet. It had been in one of the boxes in the locked room at the back of Robert Earl Lutz's house. Dempsey waited until hour 5 of the interview, when Lutz had thoroughly committed himself to his version of events, when the architecture of his alternative explanations was fully erected and seemingly solid. Then she placed a photograph on the table in front of him. The photograph showed the guitar pick. She said, "Tell me about this." The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. Dempsey counted them, watching his face, watching the flat eyes and the folded hands and the stillness of a man who had spent decades learning to be still. Then Robert Earl Lutz looked up from the photograph. And for the first time in the 6 hours they had been sitting in that room, Dempsey saw something in his eyes that was not flat. It was the look of a man doing arithmetic, calculating the gap between where he was and where he needed to be, and finding that the gap had become uncrossable. He asked for a lawyer. The interview ended. Lutz was formally placed under arrest pending charges. He was read his rights. He was transported to the Asotin County Detention Facility. He said nothing further. Outside the building, in the cold January air of the Lewis Clark Valley, Raymond Hauser stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked up at the hills that rose steeply above the town. The hills where Kimberly Logan had been buried for 16 months. The hills where, at the edge of a draw that ran directly behind the property man, now sitting in a detention cell, Angela Doris had been found today. 2 of the 4 women, 2 whose families now had something to bury. Something to hold on to in the terrible, specific way that grief requires a thing to hold on to. 2 whose families could move toward something that resembled, however inadequately, an ending. And 2 who were still missing, Donna Eckhart, Susan Fowler. Hauser thought about Carol Eckhart, who had stopped sleeping properly more than 2 years ago, who kept her daughter's bedroom exactly as it had been, who called the police department every day. He thought about Daniel Reeves with the photograph on his dashboard. They deserved answers too. He went back inside. There was still a great deal of work to do. The arrest of Robert Earl Lutz did not produce the immediate flood of answers that the families of the missing women had been hoping for. This is the part that true crime stories rarely capture adequately, the long grinding, bureaucratic reality of what happens after arrest in a complex, multi-victim case. The dramatic moment of the handcuffs, the transport, the detention facility, these things happen quickly, in the space of hours. What follows happens slowly, in the space of weeks and months and sometimes years, and it requires a different kind of endurance than the investigation itself demanded. A different kind of waiting. A waiting that knows, at least, what it is waiting for, but cannot control the pace at which it arrives. Margaret Voss and her team spent the days immediately following the arrest building the formal charging documents, with the same meticulous care that had characterized everything about this case from the beginning. The charges were serious and numerous: 2 counts of first-degree murder for Kimberly Logan and Angela Doris, whose remains had been recovered and whose deaths could be forensically established. Additional charges related to the unlawful possession of personal property belonging to the victims. And, more tentatively, charges that the prosecutor's office intended to develop further as the investigation continued into the disappearances of Donna Eckhart and Susan Fowler. The decision about whether to charge Lutz with 4 murders, or 2, was one that Voss wrestled with carefully. Her instinct was to charge what she could prove, and prove it beyond any reasonable doubt rather than overextend and risk a verdict that gave Lutz any ground to stand on. 2 solid convictions were worth infinitely more than 4 uncertain ones. But she was also aware that for the families of Donna Eckhart and Susan Fowler, not being included in the initial charges felt like a second abandonment, a second time that the system had failed to fully account for their daughters. She made the call to lead with 2 murders and pursue the others as the evidence developed. She called Carol Eckhart personally and explained the decision. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. It was not easy, but Carol Eckhart, who had spent 2.5 years demonstrating a strength that most people would never be asked to draw upon, listened to the explanation and said that she understood and that she trusted the process and that she would be there for every day of the trial. She was. Robert Earl Lutz was assigned a public defender named Gerald Marsh, no relation to Beverly Marsh, the neighbor whose initial tip had set the investigation on Lutz's trail, who was competent and experienced and faced the particular challenge of defending a client whose guilt the evidence strongly suggested, while simultaneously being constitutionally obligated to provide the most vigorous defense possible. Marsh filed a series of pretrial motions over the weeks following the arrest. He challenged the warrant for the search of the property, arguing that the application had not established sufficient probable cause to justify the scope of the search. He challenged the admissibility of the luminol evidence, arguing that the testing methodology had not been properly documented. He challenged the chain of custody on several pieces of physical evidence. He challenged the admissibility of the interview conducted before Lutz had requested counsel, arguing that certain statements made during that interview should be suppressed. Judge Patricia Armour, who presided over the pretrial proceedings, ruled on each motion in turn over the course of several weeks. She denied the challenge to the search warrant, finding that the application had established adequate probable cause. She denied the challenge to the luminol evidence after hearing expert testimony from the forensic team coordinator. She denied the chain of custody challenges. She granted a limited suppression of certain statements made in the final hour of the interview, finding that investigators had continued questioning in a manner that was arguably coercive after Lutz had made ambiguous statements that could be interpreted as a request for counsel. The suppressed statements were not, Voss determined after reviewing what had been excluded, critical to the prosecution's case. The core evidence remained intact. The trial was scheduled for September of 1982. In the months between the arrest and the trial, the investigation continued. The search of the Lutz property had been extensive but not exhaustive. 8 acres is a significant amount of ground, and the initial search, while thorough, had been conducted under time pressure and in winter conditions that limited some aspects of the work. In the spring of 1982, as the snow melted from the hills above Asotin County and the ground became workable again, a second, more comprehensive search was conducted. The cadaver dogs were brought back. They worked the property again over 2 full days, this time covering ground that had been inaccessible in the frozen January conditions. They worked the perimeter fence lines. They worked the area around the outbuildings, a barn-style storage structure and a smaller shed that had been searched visually in January but not excavated. On the second day of the spring search, one of the dogs indicated on an area behind the storage structure. Excavation revealed a third set of human remains. The condition and location suggested a period of interment consistent with the earliest disappearances. The forensic anthropologist estimated that the remains had been in the ground for approximately 2 to 3 years, placing the time of death within the window of the earliest cases. Dental comparison, conducted over the following 2 weeks, produced a match. Susan Marie Fowler, nursing student. Runner. The woman who had called her boyfriend from a payphone and said she loved him and never made it home. She had been, the entire time, less than 50 yards from the back wall of Robert Earl Lutz's house. Hauser called Daniel Reeves personally. The conversation was one of the hardest he had ever had. Not because Daniel Reeves was unprepared. He had lived with the knowledge of what had probably happened for 2.5 years, had built himself a fragile accommodation with the likelihood of it. But because preparation and reality are different things, and no amount of anticipation makes the confirmation easier to hear. Daniel thanked Hauser for calling. He asked if she had suffered. Hauser told him what he could, which was not much, and told him honestly when he didn't know, which was also not much. He drove to the office afterward and sat at his desk for a while without doing anything. Then he pulled out the Eckhart file, Donna, the only one still unaccounted for. The search of the hills above the property, the terrain accessible through the draw that ran behind Lutz's land, was conducted in sections over the course of the spring and early summer, as weather and resources permitted. It was difficult, arduous work in steep, rocky terrain that had no roads and few accessible trails, country that tested the physical endurance of everyone involved, and required the forensic teams to work in conditions far removed from the controlled environment of a laboratory. They found 2 additional sites in the hills. The first site yielded animal remains, a deer likely killed by a hunter and not recovered, several years old. The dogs had correctly identified the presence of biological material. The material simply was not what they were looking for. The second site, approximately 2 miles from where Kimberly Logan had been found, in a different drainage on the far side of a ridge that required nearly 3 hours of hiking to access from the nearest road, produced a result that investigators had both hoped for and dreaded in equal measure. Human remains, female, adult. The forensic anthropologist's initial assessment placed the period of interment at the high end of the range, possibly the oldest set of remains recovered in the entire investigation. Dental comparison was requested immediately. The confirmation came back within 10 days. Donna Marie Eckhart, 22 years old. The restaurant sketches in the notebook under the counter. The phone calls with her sister every evening. The daughter that Carol had been waiting for through 2.5 years of sleepless nights. She had been in the hills above the Lewis Clark Valley since not long after the night she had walked out of the diner and waved goodbye, and said she'd see everyone tomorrow. Hauser drove to Carol Eckhart's house. He sat with her for a long time. When he left, he sat in his car in her driveway for several minutes before he was ready to drive. With all 4 victims now accounted for, the prosecution's case entered a new phase. Margaret Voss amended the charges against Robert Earl Lutz to include 4 counts of first-degree murder. The forensic evidence from the 2 additional recovery sites, combined with the existing evidence, the trophies found in the locked room, the phone records, the witness testimony, and the physical evidence from the initial property search, built a case that Voss considered, in her careful and precise way, to be as strong as a primarily circumstantial case could be. There was still no confession. There was still no single eyewitness who had seen Lutz commit any of the crimes. There was still the fundamental challenge that all 4 victims had died in a manner, and at a location that did not permit the kind of direct forensic linkage, trace evidence, fingerprints, biological material from the perpetrator on the victim that a prosecutor most wanted. But there were the trophies. This was, in Voss's assessment, the most powerful element of the physical evidence. The locked room with its carefully organized boxes of personal property belonging to the victims was something that defense counsel was going to struggle to explain away. Gerald Marsh's best argument was that Lutz had found these items at job sites, or had come by them through innocent means. But the guitar pick that Kimberly Logan had carried in her wallet as a good luck charm since high school was not something that ended up on a job site. The nursing school name badge was not something that fell out of a pocket on a sidewalk. The notebook of restaurant sketches in Donna Eckhart's handwriting was not something that a person collected innocently and stored in a locked room without mentioning it to anyone. The trophies told a story that no alternative explanation could adequately account for. Voss built her opening statement around them. The trial of Robert Earl Lutz began on September 8, 1982. In the district courthouse in Asotin County, the courtroom was packed. There were people who had traveled from other parts of Idaho and Washington to attend. Reporters from regional and national outlets filled the press section. The families of all 4 victims were present. Carol Eckhart in the front row of the gallery, her back straight and her eyes forward, exactly as she had been every single day of this process. Daniel Reeves, still carrying himself with the particular weight of a person who has been grieving for a very long time. The Logan family, together holding on to each other in the quiet way of people who have learned to do that. The Fowler family, who had driven from Oregon. Robert Earl Lutz sat at the defense table in a suit that looked slightly too formal for him, as though it belonged to a version of himself he had constructed for this occasion. His large, rough hands were folded on the table. His flat eyes looked straight ahead. Margaret Voss stood at the prosecution table and surveyed the courtroom for a moment before she began. Then she turned to the jury. She spent the first 20 minutes of her opening statement talking about the 4 women. Not the crime, not the evidence, the women. She described Donna Eckhart's restaurant sketches and her laugh, and the phone calls with her sister. She described Kimberly Logan's guitar playing and her certainty about second grade and her Sunday calls home. She described Susan Fowler's morning runs and her nursing rotations, and the last phone call from the payphone. She described Angela Doris's photography class in her bay window, and her determination to see things properly for the first time. She made the jury see them. Then she said, "The defendant took all of this from them. And the evidence in this case will show you exactly how we know that." The gallery was absolutely silent. Gerald Marsh's opening statement was careful and methodical, and covered the ground it needed to cover: the absence of direct eyewitness evidence, the circumstantial nature of the physical evidence, the alternative explanations for each piece of the prosecution's case. He was skilled and prepared, and he delivered his argument well. And he was working uphill, and everyone in the courtroom could feel it. The prosecution called 37 witnesses over the course of 3 weeks. The first several days were devoted to establishing the facts of each disappearance, the investigating officers, the family members who had reported the women missing, the witnesses who had last seen them. These witnesses laid the factual foundation of the case, and equally importantly, they continued the work that Voss had begun in her opening statement. They made the jury see the 4 women as real people whose absence was real, and whose deaths were real, and whose killer sat 12 feet away from the witness, stand with his flawed eyes and his folded hands. Patricia Holden, the gas station cashier with the excellent memory, testified about seeing the dark blue truck on an evening consistent with Kimberly Logan's disappearance. She was precise and credible and withstood cross-examination without difficulty. Gerald Marsh attempted to establish that she could not be certain of the exact date, and she acknowledged this while holding firm to her description of the evening in the vehicle. Charlene Briggs testified about seeing Lutz's truck emerging from the side road on the evening of Angela Doris's disappearance. She was, of all the witnesses, the one Marsh spent the most time on cross-examination. He challenged her recollection of the date, her ability to identify the truck at 300 yards in the evening, her claimed familiarity with the vehicle from prior occasions. Briggs answered every challenge with the steady composure of someone who had thought carefully about what she didn't know and was not going to be moved from either position. Marsh made some points. He was a capable attorney and the jury was paying attention, but he did not break her. The forensic witnesses were devastating. The forensic team coordinator walked the jury through the luminol testing of the house with the help of enlarged photographs that showed the blue-white glow under ultraviolet light in the living area, the bathroom, the kitchen. He explained the chemistry simply and clearly, establishing that luminol does not produce false positives for paint or cleaning chemicals, or the other alternatives that Marsh would later attempt to raise. He explained that the pattern of the reactions was consistent with a large quantity of blood that had been extensively cleaned. The forensic anthropologist testified about the recovery of remains from all 4 sites: the clearing in the hills, the wooded area at the edge of the property, the location behind the storage structure, and the drainage on the far side of the ridge. She testified about the trauma findings, the hyoid fractures consistent with strangulation in the 2 cases where the condition of the remains permitted this determination, and about the dental identifications. The phone records analyst presented the evidence of the 3 payphone calls made from near the college campus on 3 of the 4 evenings in question, connecting each call to the motel 40 miles east. The motel clerk, an elderly man with a precise memory and no apparent agenda, testified that a guest consistent with the physical description of Robert Earl Lutz had been registered on each of those evenings under different names. Then Voss called the evidence technician, who had catalogued the contents of the locked room. The technician described each item in the boxes methodically and without drama, which made it more devastating rather than less. The jewelry, the clothing, the photographs, the guitar pick, the nursing school name badge. The note for each item. Voss asked a simple question. And did you find any documentation, receipt, or record suggesting how this item came to be in the defendant's possession? Each time the answer was the same. No, Mom. Voss introduced each item as evidence and asked the technician to describe it for the jury. When the guitar pick was described, purple with a star pattern, recovered from a small box on the second shelf of the storage unit. She paused before moving to the next item. She let the jury look at the photograph of it. She let the silence do its work. She called Kimberly Logan's parents next. Her mother identified the guitar pick from the witness stand. Her voice broke once briefly, when she was asked to confirm that this was the item her daughter had carried in her wallet since high school. She composed herself and answered clearly. Yes, she said. That's Kim's. The courtroom was very quiet. Voss called Carol Eckhart. Carol identified the notebook from the witness stand. She was asked to describe the contents. She did so in a steady, clear voice that never once wavered, describing the restaurant sketches and the menu ideas and the color schemes, and the names her daughter had been considering, describing them in enough detail that the jury understood precisely what this notebook was, and what it represented and what the person who had created had hoped and planned for. Then Voss asked, "Do you have any doubt that this notebook belonged to your daughter Donna?" Carol Eckhart said. The defense case lasted 4 days. Gerald Marsh called 8 witnesses, most of them character witnesses or experts retained to challenge specific elements of the forensic testimony. The most significant of these was a forensic chemist who testified that luminol testing could produce reactions to substances other than blood, including certain plant materials and some household cleaning products. Voss cross-examined him effectively, establishing that the specific pattern and quantity of reactions found in the Lutz house were inconsistent with non-blood explanations and that his testimony, while technically accurate about luminol's limitations, did not adequately account for the actual evidence in this case. Marsh did not call Robert Earl Lutz to testify. This was almost certainly the correct tactical decision. Lutz had demonstrated during the interview with Sergeant Dempsey that he was controlled and adaptive under questioning, but cross-examination by Margaret Voss in a courtroom with 4 murder charges on the table was a different proposition entirely. Marsh made the calculation that the risks outweighed the potential benefits. His closing argument was disciplined and technically proficient. He walked the jury through each piece of evidence and the alternative explanation for it. He emphasized the absence of direct eyewitness testimony, the absence of biological material from Lutz on any of the victims, the inherently circumstantial nature of the case. He reminded the jury of their obligation to the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt and argued that the prosecution had not met that standard. It was the best argument available with the evidence at hand. Margaret Voss's closing argument lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. She began where she had begun in her opening statement, with the 4 women. She brought them back into the room one more time, these 4 people who could not be there to speak for themselves, and she made sure the jury remembered who they were before she asked the jury to make them justice. Then she walked through the evidence. Methodically, piece by piece, she addressed each of Marsh's alternative explanations and dismantled them with the careful logic that had characterized her entire prosecution of the case. She showed the jury how the individual pieces of evidence, while each potentially explicable in isolation, formed a pattern when viewed together that admitted of only one coherent interpretation. She talked about the trophies last. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "the defendant kept those items in a locked room in a concrete, walled storage space at the back of his house. He kept a guitar pick that a 19-year-old girl had carried in her wallet since high school. He kept a note of a woman's dreams about her future. He kept these things locked away, organized, preserved, not because he found them at a job site, Not because someone gave them to him, because he took them, because he was there, because he is the reason these 4 women are not. She paused. The evidence asks you for one thing, she said. It asks you to see what is plainly in front of you. It asks you to follow the only path through the evidence that makes coherent sense. And it asks you, on behalf of Donna Eckhart and Kimberly Logan and Susan Fowler and Angela Doris, to hold the person responsible for their deaths accountable for what he did. She sat down. The courtroom was silent for a long moment. Then Judge Armour addressed the jury and sent them to deliberate. The jury was out for 3 days. They sent 3 notes to the judge during that time. One asking for clarification on the legal standard for circumstantial evidence, one requesting to review the phone records again, and one requesting to see the luminol photographs a second time. Each request was accommodated. Each time the jury returned to the deliberation room, those in the courtroom, the families, the investigators, the attorneys, waited in the particular suspended state that only the wait for a jury verdict produces. Hauser spent most of the 3 days in the courthouse. He brought paperwork, files from other cases that needed attention, things to occupy his hands while his mind stayed in the deliberation room. He drank courthouse coffee and sat in the corridor outside the courtroom and talked to Prescott and thought about the 4 women and waited. On the 3rd day, at 2:17 in the afternoon, the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled in under 20 minutes. Robert Earl Lutz was brought in. He sat at the defense table. His hands were folded. If he was afraid, he did not show it. If he felt anything at all in that moment, he did not show it. The jury filed in. The foreperson, a middle-aged man who ran a farm supply business in Clarkston, and who had sat through 3 weeks of testimony with an expression of focused attention that told observers nothing about his conclusions, stood and delivered the verdicts. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Donna Marie Eckhart, guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Kimberly Ann Logan, guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Susan Marie Fowler, guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Angela Rose Doris, guilty. The gallery did not erupt. This was not a Hollywood moment of cheers and tears and chaos. The sound that moved through the courtroom was something quieter and more complex than that, a collective exhalation, as though a great weight had been briefly lifted, not removed but acknowledged, named, given a shape that could finally be held. Carol Eckhart closed her eyes. She kept them closed for a moment. Then she opened them and looked straight ahead, and the expression on her face was something that defied easy categorization. Not happiness, not triumph, not even relief in any simple sense. Something that existed in the specific emotional territory that only people who have been through what she had been through could fully understand. Something like she is not forgotten. Something like it mattered. Raymond Hauser was standing at the back of the courtroom when the verdicts were read. He had been in this business long enough to know that verdicts did not restore what had been lost. He had watched enough families leave courthouses carrying verdicts like bandages over wounds that would never fully close. He understood, with the clear-eyed realism of a man who had spent his career looking directly at the worst things people did to one another, that 4 guilty verdicts did not give back to these families what Robert Earl Lutz had taken from them. But they were something. They were the system, working the way the system was supposed to work. Slowly and imperfectly, and at enormous cost to everyone involved, but ultimately arriving at the truth and naming it and holding it accountable. That was something. He let himself feel that for a moment. Then he put on his coat and walked out of the courthouse, and stood in the September air of the Lewis Clark Valley, and looked up at the hills. The sentencing hearing for Robert Earl Lutz was scheduled for November 14, 1982. In the weeks between the verdict and the sentencing, the Lewis Clark Valley existed in a state of collective processing that communities enter after something enormous has happened. Something that has shaken the foundations of how people understood their home and their neighbors, and the invisible social agreements that make ordinary life feel safe. The trial had brought everything back into sharp focus. The disappearances, the searches, the discovery of the remains, the locked room and its terrible contents, All of it had been laid out in a courtroom in precise, documented detail. And the community had absorbed it the way you absorb a blow that you knew was coming, but that hits harder than anticipated anyway. People talked about it in the way that people in small communities talk about things that matter, in diners and on front porches, and in the parking lots of grocery stores, in the quiet spaces between other conversations, in the hours after the children had gone to bed. They talked about how they had known something was wrong. They talked about the women. Donna and Kimberly and Susan and Angela, with the specific tenderness that communities reserve for those they have collectively mourned. They talked about what it meant that a man could live among them for decades, could buy his hardware at the same store and eat his lunch at the same diners, and drive his truck on the same roads, and carry within him something that none of them had seen, or almost none of them. Beverly Marsh, whose phone call to the Assabet County Sheriff's Office had started the thread that the investigation ultimately pulled apart, was not celebrated publicly. She had not sought attention and did not want it. But people who knew her understood what she had done and what it had cost her, the discomfort of speaking against a neighbor. And the months of uncertainty while she waited to see whether her information mattered. The weight of knowing that she had waited as long as she had before making the call. She carried that last part with her. Hauser knew this because she had told him so directly in a conversation they had after the verdict. "If I had called sooner," she said. "You called," he told her. "That's what matters." She didn't entirely believe him. He understood that. Some things you carry regardless of what other people tell you about them. But he meant what he said. And he said it because it was true. She had called, and the call had mattered, and whatever her reasons for the delay, the decision she had ultimately made was the right one, and it had contributed to 4 guilty verdicts and 4 families with answers. That was not nothing. That was the opposite of nothing. The sentencing hearing was held in the same courtroom where the trial had taken place, before the same judge, with the same attorneys, and many of the same faces in the gallery. The families of all 4 victims were present again. Carol Eckhart was in the front row again. Daniel Reeves was there and the Logan family. And the Fallers who had driven from Oregon again, because they had decided, collectively, that they were going to be present for every moment of his process that was available to them. They had earned that presence. Nobody was going to take it from them. The procedure for a sentencing hearing in Idaho in 1982 allowed for victim impact statements, a relatively recent legal development that had formalized the practice of allowing the families of victims to address the court before sentence was imposed. Margaret Voss had worked with each family in the weeks leading up to the hearing, helping them understand the process and supporting them in preparing whatever they wanted to say. Not all of them chose to speak, but some of them did. Carol Eckhart spoke first. She stood at the podium in the front of the courtroom and arranged her papers in front of her with the same precise, deliberate composure she had carried through every public moment of the past 3 years. She did not look at Robert Earl Lutz, who sat at the defense table 10 feet to her left. She looked at Judge Armour, and beyond the judge, at some point in the middle distance that seemed to be where she had decided to anchor herself for this. She spoke for 11 minutes. She described Donna as a child, the ceramic animals on the windowsill, the way she had learned to read by age 4 and had never lost the habit, the laugh that everyone remembered. She described Donna as a young woman, the diner, the business administration classes, the notebook under the counter with the restaurant sketches and the menu ideas and the carefully considered names. She described what it had been like to wait, the 2.5 years of not knowing, the phone calls to the police department every day, the flyers on the telephone poles, the particular cruelty of hope maintained over a long period without resolution, hope becoming its own kind of suffering. She described the morning Hauser had come to her house and told her what had been found in the hills above the valley. "I had known for a long time," she said, in the way that mothers know. But knowing and being told are different things. And I want this court to understand that the day I was told was one of the worst days of my life. But it was also, and I say this carefully, because I mean it carefully, also a day when something ended that had been very hard to bear. The not knowing. The waiting, the having to hold both possibilities at once. That she was alive somewhere and that she was not, and not being able to grieve properly because grief requires a fact and I did not have one. She paused. My daughter deserved to live, she said. She deserved her restaurant and her classes and her phone calls with her sister and everything else she was planning. She was 22 years old. She had done nothing to deserve what happened to her. And I want the court, before it decides what this man's life is worth, to fully understand what my daughter's life was worth. What all 4 of those young women's lives were worth. She gathered her papers. She returned to her seat without looking at Robert Earl Lutz. The courtroom was very quiet. Kimberly Logan's father spoke next. He was a quiet man, a high school science teacher, not accustomed to public speaking and visibly uncomfortable at the podium in a way that made his presence there more moving rather than less. He spoke in a low, deliberate voice, choosing his words with the careful precision of someone who had written and rewritten this statement many times. He talked about the Sunday phone calls. He said that in the months after Kimberly disappeared, he had continued to keep Sunday evenings free, not consciously, not deliberately, but out of some reflex that his body maintained even after his mind had accepted the likelihood of what had happened. He would find himself at home on Sunday evenings near the phone. Not quite waiting, but not waiting either. He said this had gone on for longer than he was comfortable admitting. He said that what he wanted the court to understand was that the harm done in this case was not contained to the 4 women who had died. It radiated outward. It touched every person who had loved them. It changed those people in ways that could not be undone, and could not be fully described in the time available to him in a courtroom. He said that he hoped the sentence imposed would reflect not only the 4 murders but the full circumference of the damage done. He thanked the judge for her attention. He went back to his seat. His wife took his hand. Angela Doris had no family present who chose to speak. She had come to the Lewis-Clark Valley from Montana, and her family, while present through the trial, had found the process of victim impact statements too difficult to navigate publicly. Their absence from the podium was not an absence of grief or of feeling. It was simply the form that their particular grief took, and it was respected. Susan Fowler's younger brother spoke briefly and simply, without notes, standing at the podium with his hands at his sides. He said, "My sister ran 5 miles every morning before most people were awake. She did it because she said it made her feel like day was already hers, before anything else could happen to it. I think about that a lot, that she started every day that way. I think she deserved more days." He sat down. There was a silence in the courtroom after he sat that lasted longer than the procedural silences usually last, as though the room itself was taking a moment. Gerald Marsh made a statement in mitigation on behalf of his client. He acknowledged the gravity of the crimes and the suffering of the families. He noted Lutz's lack of prior criminal history, the single misdemeanor from 1974 being the entirety of his official record before these events. He asked the court consider in its deliberations on sentence the full range of options available under Idaho law. He did not put Lutz himself forward to make a statement. Lutz sat at the defense table throughout the proceedings with his hands folded and his eyes flat, and his expression producing nothing that anyone in that room could read. He did not look at the families when they spoke. He did not look at the photographs of the 4 women that were displayed on a board near the prosecution table. He looked at a point somewhere slightly above, and to the left of wherever the current speaker was, in the specific way of someone who has decided not to be present at their own sentencing. Margaret Voss made the prosecution statement on sentencing. She was brief and precise, as she always was, and she asked the court to impose the maximum sentence available under Idaho law on each of the 4 counts, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, and to impose those sentences consecutively rather than concurrently, reflecting the fact that these were 4 separate crimes against 4 separate human beings, and that the sentence should honor that separateness. She also noted, for the record, that the investigation had identified Robert Earl Lutz as a suspect in the disappearances of additional women in the broader region. Women whose cases had not been charged in this proceeding, but whose families deserved to know that the investigation had not concluded simply because this trial had. She asked that the court take note of this in its considerations. This was a carefully calculated statement, made with the full awareness that it introduced information that could not be substantiated in the current proceeding. Marsh objected. Judge Armour sustained the objection in part, instructing that the statement regarding uncharged matters would not be considered in the sentencing determination for the current charges. But it was said. It was on the record, and the reporters in the press section wrote it down. Judge Patricia Armour imposed sentence. She spoke at some length before announcing her decision, addressing the courtroom in the measured, precise language of a jurist who understood that her words in this moment would be read and examined for years to come. She spoke about the nature of the crimes, their premeditation, their sustained duration, their impact on the community and the families. She spoke about the 4 women by name, each one individually, in a gesture that was unusual in a sentencing proceeding, and that several of the families would later say meant more to them than they had anticipated. She said, "This court has presided over many serious proceedings in its time, but the evidence presented in the trial of Robert Earl Lutz represents something that stands apart in its deliberate cruelty, its duration, and its impact on the fabric of this community. The defendant preyed on young women in a valley where people knew and trusted their neighbors. He exploited that trust. He exploited the geography of this place that he knew intimately, and he compounded the harm of the crimes themselves by concealing them in a manner that denied the families of his victims the ability to grieve, to know, to begin any process of healing." She paused. This court has heard from those families today. It has listened carefully, and it takes their words fully into account. She announced the sentences. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on each of the 4 counts of first-degree murder. The sentences to run consecutively. Robert Earl Lutz would spend the remainder of his natural life in the Idaho State Correctional Institution. He would not be eligible for parole. He would not be released. Lutz received the sentence with his characteristic stillness. He was taken from the courtroom by corrections officers. He did not look at the families. He did not look at anyone. The door closed behind him. The aftermath of a case like this one does not end with a sentencing. It continues in various forms for years and decades, because the people most affected by it continue to live their lives in the presence of what happened, and there is no verdict, no sentence, no legal proceeding that fully relieves that weight. What justice does, what it can do at its best, is provide a framework, a structure that acknowledges what happened, names the person responsible, and imposes a consequence. It cannot undo. It cannot restore. It can only account for and hold and say this mattered. These lives mattered. This was wrong, and we name it as wrong, and we will not pretend otherwise. Carol Eckhart returned to work at a local accounting firm in Lewiston 3 months after the sentencing. She had taken a leave of absence during the trial period and had not been certain, during the weeks after the verdict, whether she was ready to return. But she found, when she went back, that the structure of ordinary days was something she needed, not as an escape from what had happened, but as a way of continuing to exist in the world that Donna had lived in, and that she herself intended to keep living in. She kept Donna's bedroom as it had been for another year. Then she changed it slowly, making it into a space that was still Donna's in the ways that mattered. The books on the shelf, the ceramic animals on the windowsill, but that was also livable, visitable, a room you could sit in without feeling the full weight of absence pressing down from every surface. She kept the phone calls with Donna's sister, her younger daughter, every evening. They still talked every evening. They had never stopped. Daniel Reeves kept the photograph of Susan on his dashboard for 4 years after the sentencing. Then, one morning in the spring of 1986, he took it down and placed it in a frame and put it on the bookshelf in his living room, where it remained. He said later, to someone who asked, that he hadn't planned to move it on that particular morning. It had simply felt like the right time, the way some things do. Like the morning had already made the decision before he was fully awake. He thought about Susan every day. He expected he always would. He eventually married a woman he met in Boise, where he had relocated in 1984 for work. He was not the same person he had been before August 22, 1981, and he didn't pretend to be. He had learned over the years that carrying something like this didn't mean you couldn't also carry other things. That grief and love and ordinary happiness could coexist in a person, uneasily and imperfectly, but genuinely. Susan would have been glad for him, he thought. She was practical like that. Raymond Hauser retired from the Lewiston Police Department in 1991, after 22 years of service. At his retirement gathering, held in a conference room at the department with bad coffee and a sheet cake that someone had ordered from the grocery store, his colleagues gave speeches and told stories and presented him with a framed commendation from the city. He accepted all of it with the same quiet, self-effacing composure that had characterized everything else about his professional life. After the gathering late in the evening, he stopped by his office one more time. He sat at his desk, the same desk where he had spread the files of Donna Eckhart and Kimberly Logan side by side, and first understood that he was dealing with a single criminal pattern rather than separate incidents. The desk was cleared now, his personal items already boxed and taken home by his daughter, who had insisted on coming to help. The drawers were empty. The surface was clean. He sat there for a while in the quiet building. He thought about the 4 women. He did this still, periodically, the way he had always done it, deliberately, individually, making himself slow down and remember each one as a person rather than as a case. He had never stopped. He didn't think he ever would. He thought about Beverly Marsh and Patricia Holden and Charlene Briggs, the 3 women whose courage and decision to speak had provided the threads that allowed the investigation to build its case. He thought about Margaret Voss and her legal pad covered in notes. He thought about Prescott, who had eventually joined the Idaho State Police and done well for himself. He turned off the light. He locked his office for the last time. He drove home through the Lewis-Clark Valley in the summer evening, the hills rising gold above the river, the bridge gleaming in the last light. Robert Earl Lutz filed a series of appeals in the years following his conviction. The appeals challenged the validity of the search warrant, the admissibility of various pieces of evidence, the jury instruction on circumstantial evidence, and the constitutionality of consecutive life sentences. Each appeal was reviewed by the Idaho Court of Appeals and subsequently by the Idaho Supreme Court. Each was denied. The legal challenges generated significant documentation and occupied the time of numerous attorneys and judges over a period of nearly a decade, but they produced no change in the fundamental outcome of the case. He never confessed. Not once in all the years that followed did Robert Earl Lutz acknowledge what he had done. He did not speak about the 4 women. He did not speak about the locked room and its contents. He did not speak about the hills above the valley, where he had carried the people he had killed and left them in the ground. He maintained in the flat, turned inward silence that had characterized him throughout the trial and sentencing, a permanent state of non-engagement with the real of the evidence had established. This was, for some of the families, the most difficult aspect of the aftermath. Not the sentence was appropriate, the sentence was what the law provided and it was sufficient. But the silence. The absence of any acknowledgement, any explanation, any moment in which the human reality of what he had done was admitted to by the person who had done it. Some families find that a confession matters less than they anticipated it would once the conviction is secured. The legal fact of guilt, established and recorded, provides something to stand on. Others find that the silence leaves a specific kind of question unanswered, not the legal question of who, but the human question of why, and that this question persists. Carol Eckhart, asked about this in an interview she gave to a regional newspaper on the 10th anniversary of the verdict, said something that stayed with the interviewer for a long time. She said, "I spent a long time wanting him to explain it, wanting some answer that would make it make sense. And eventually I understood that there isn't one. Not because he's keeping it from me, but because there is no explanation that would actually make it make sense. Some things don't resolve into sense. You just have to carry them as they are. She paused. She said, Donna was real. She was here. She was loved. Nothing he does or doesn't say changes that. The Lewis Clark Valley recovered, in the way that places recover from the things that happen in them. It did not forget. Communities that have been through something like this do not forget. It becomes part of the texture of the place, part of the story that long-time residents carry and pass on to people who arrive later and want to understand where they have come to. The valley remains what it has always been, genuinely beautiful, genuinely connected, a place where the rivers meet and the hills rise, and the light at certain times of year does what the light does and stops you in your sentences. But it carries the knowledge of what happened here. The Lewis Clark State College campus installed new lighting in the years following the case, extended its security protocols, established a safety escort program that allowed students to request accompaniment when walking at night. These practical changes were modest in the scope of what they could actually prevent. The task force and the subsequent trial had made clear that the perpetrator had been someone who moved through the community without obvious warning. Someone who presented no obvious danger until he did, which is the most frightening kind of danger because it offers no reliable defense. But the changes were made, because communities do what they can, because doing something, even something imperfect, is the response that people who are not helpless make. Detective Prescott, who had been the young deputy whose phone call to Hauser about Beverly Marsh's tip had redirected the investigation, eventually rose to the rank of lieutenant with the Idaho State Police. He specialized in cold cases and multi-jurisdictional investigations, bringing to those cases the same methodical patience he had developed during the 2 years of the Lewis Clark Valley investigation. He spoke about the case occasionally, in professional contexts, training sessions, law enforcement conferences, discussions about investigative methodology in cases without strong physical evidence. He talked about the importance of cross-jurisdictional communication. He talked about the value of seemingly minor witness observations, the dark truck, the neighbor's phone call, the gas station cashier with the exceptional memory. He talked about the way cases build incrementally, each small piece adding to the ones before it. The picture assembling itself in the dark room, one uncertain outline at a time. He never talked about the locked room. Some things you carry without discussing. Margaret Voss went on to serve as a Soudan County prosecutor for another 12 years, retiring in 1994 with a record that included dozens of successful serious felony prosecutions. She was appointed to the Washington State Court of Appeals in 1996 and served on the bench for 15 years. Her former colleagues described her consistently with the same vocabulary: precise, methodical, impossible to rattle. She kept a small framed photograph on her desk throughout her judicial career. 4 photographs actually arranged in a single frame. 4 young women photographed in the ordinary moments of their life: a diner, a dormitory room, a hospital corridor, a sunny street. Not crime scene photographs. Just photographs of people being alive. When colleagues asked about the photograph, she explained briefly who they were. Then she returned to whatever she had been doing. The questions that Robert Earl Lutz never answered, the whys and the hows and the full accounting of what he had done, left investigators and the community with an incomplete picture that would never be fully completed. Margaret Voss's statement at the sentencing hearing, noting that Lutz had been identified as a suspect in additional disappearances beyond the 4 charged, pointed toward the possibility that was Nellie investigated to resolution. There were women, in the broader region of eastern Idaho and eastern Washington, who had disappeared in the years surrounding the Lewis Clark Valley murders, whose cases remained officially open, whose families remained in the particular suspended state of the unresolved. Some investigators believed that Lutz's crimes extended beyond the 4 women for whom he had been convicted. The 8-year span of his unmonitored movement through the region, the methodical nature of his concealment, the specific geography of the Lewis Clark Valley, with its remote hills and hidden draws, all of this suggested to those who had studied him most closely that 4 was not the complete number. This was never proved. The additional cases were never officially closed. The possibility lived in the file rooms of several law enforcement agencies as an open question that the man who could have answered it chose, permanently, not to address. Robert Earl Lutz died in the Idaho State Correctional Institution on March 3, 2009 of cardiac arrest. He was 66 years old. He had served 27 years of his consecutive life sentences. He had made no statements of consequence during that time. He had not sought contact with the families of his victims. He had not cooperated with investigators looking into the additional disappearances. He had existed within the walls of the institution with the same flat, turned inward silence that had characterized him throughout the trial and sentencing, going through the motions of institutional life without engaging with the human reality of his situation, or the human reality of what he had done. The news of his death was received differently by different people. Some felt relief. The permanent, irreversible end of any remaining uncertainty about whether he might someday be released. Any remaining need to monitor appeals or proceedings or changes in law that might affect his status. He was gone. The threat he represented, even from inside a prison cell. The threat of his continued existence in the world was over. Some felt nothing in particular, having long since built their lives around the fact of his imprisonment. The further fact of his death changed nothing fundamental about how they understood their loss. He had been absent from their lives for 27 years. His absence in death was continuous with his absence in life. Some felt a complicated grief that surprised them, not for the man, not for anything he had been or might have been, but for the answers that died with him. The women whose cases remained open. The families who would never now receive even the possibility of a confession or an acknowledgement. The questions that would remain questions permanently. Carol Eckhart, now in her 70s, was told of his death by her younger daughter, who had seen it on the news. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she had thought about this moment for a long time, and had never quite known what she would feel. When it came, she said that what she felt mostly was tired, not of Donna. Never of Donna, but of the weight of carrying this thing, this enormous, terrible thing, for all these years, and a small, quiet sense that the carrying might be, in some form, closer to over now than it had ever been before. Not over, not resolved, not made right, but closer. The Lewis Clark Valley is still there. The Snake River still curves through the landscape, catching the light in the evening. The hills still rise steeply on either side, covered in bunch grass and basalt, glowing amber and gold in the right season. Lewiston is still on the Idaho side, Clarkston still on the Washington side, connected by the bridge and by everything else. People still know each other here. Still wave from front porches and hold doors and bring casseroles when a neighbor is sick. There is a memorial at Lewis Clark State College, a small garden, established by the student government in 1985, with a stone marker that bears the names of the 4 women who were connected to the campus and to the community, and to the valley that the college sits in. The garden is maintained by student volunteers, and each spring new students tend it who may not know the full story of the names on the stone, who may have to be told, and who, when they are told, tend to be quiet for a moment in the way that young people are when they first fully understand that the world contains this kind of darkness. The names on the stone are Donna Marie Eckhart, Kimberly Ann Logan, Susan Mary Fowler, Angela Rose Doris. They were real. They were here. They were loved. The valor things that cases like this one teach us, if we are willing to learn them. They teach us that evil rarely announces itself, that the most dangerous people are often the one to present a surface that offers no obvious warning, who move through communities and workplaces and neighborhoods without triggering the alarms that we have been taught to watch for, because the alarms we watch for are calibrated for a kind of danger that announces itself, and this kind of danger does not. They teach us the importance of listening to the quiet voice that says something is wrong, even when you cannot articulate what or why, even when the person around whom that voice speaks presents no official record and no obvious reason for concern. Beverly Marsh had that voice for years. She had found it difficult to act on, for reasons that are entirely understandable and that most of us would share. When she finally acted on it, it mattered. They teach us the value of the people who stay on cases when staying is hard, who keep coming back to the files when there is nothing new in them, who refuse to let the absence of easy answers become the acceptance of no answer. Raymond Hauser kept coming back. For 2 years. Through dead ends and misdirections and the grinding frustration of a case that gave up its secrets slowly and reluctantly, he kept coming back. They teach us that communities can survive terrible things, that the fabric of a place, though it can be torn, has a resilience that is not the same as forgetting. The Lewis Clark Valley carries what happened here. It carries it in the memorial garden, and in the institutional memory of its law enforcement agencies, and in the conversations of long-time residents, and in the quiet, specific way that communities carry their histories. But it also continues. The river continues. The light continues. The people who live here continue to build their lives in this valley that is genuinely, stubbornly beautiful, and that belongs to them as much as it ever did. And they teach us, perhaps most importantly, that the people at the center of these stories, the ones whose names appear on stone markers and in case files, and in the memories of everyone who loved them, deserve to be more than victims in someone else's account of events. They deserve to be seen as who they were before everything else. Donna Eckhart, who wanted a restaurant. Kimberly Logan, who was certain about second grade. Susan Fowler, who made the day hers before anything else could happen to it. Angela Doris, who was learning to see things properly for the first time. Remember them that way. That is the truest thing this story has to offer. Thank you for listening tonight. If this case moved you, if these 4 women stayed with you the way I hope they did, please leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me which of their stories stayed with you. Tell me what you're thinking, and if you haven't already, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so that more stories like this one can find the people who need to hear them. Take care of each other out there. Good night, and stay safe.